Okay, welcome to the WPIAL Blitz Show podcast. My name is Bruce Badgley, and along with me, Ian McMeans. And Ian, I tell you what, we are ready to take a look at another week of fantastic action here in the WPIAL. I'll tell you what, it was a very interesting week, and we've got a very interesting week to take a look at as far as forward thinking, too, right?
Absolutely. We've surpassed the midpoint in the season now, and we've entered the home stretch. The calendar has flipped to October, and this is where things really heat up, and you kind of separate the wheat from the chaff and figure out who's going to make the playoffs and who's ultimately going to make that run to the championships.
Yeah, about this time of the season, going into now, you know, each team has their own chemistry. We kind of know who, the players really are. We kind of know the teams that are, trying to fight for a playoff spot. And you really kind of know what teams are kind of, going to be some of the also rans. But there's still a lot of spots to be determined, especially in the WPIAL. So why don't we go ahead and get started, my friend? You've got control.
All right. We will take it away and run with it. We've got a lot to talk about tonight, as always, but now as the playoff races start to heat up, we really start to get into the thick of some of the analysis too. So if you're tuning in, you obviously know where to find us on YouTube. Thanks for joining us either live, hit us up in the chat. We're happy to answer questions or, hear where you're tuning in from, or, you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or our rarely used Instagram account, as well as checking out all of my articles on games of the week and standings pages and everything else related to the WPIAL on SteelCityBlitz.com. We also cover the Steelers, which has been an interesting season to say the least. But
yeah, I miss your. I'll be honest with you. I'm just being honest here. I've got to get in and start watching your Steelers stuff and get involved in that pregame. Usually, it's pretty crazy for me on Sundays. A lot of that's youth football day for me, quite honestly. But I always have my phone, so I'm gonna have to start checking in for your Steelers show there because I'm sure that it's going to be chock full of stuff.
it's yeah, the vibe of that show is a little different than this one. That one much more has the vibe of like four guys sitting around drinking whiskey talking football, but we're all very knowledgeable about football, but there's also a little more drinking and a little more swearing than there is on this show.
Well,
So but the Steelers deserve it after the way they've played this year too. So at any rate.
Exactly right. Exactly right. All right, here we go.
All right. So some big results this week. Knock, who's head coach we interviewed a few weeks ago, got a big win over Deer Lakes. Last year, they played to a 1-point high scoring game. I think it was 37-36 last year. Knock secures the victory this year in a runaway over Deer Lakes, really setting themselves up well to make a run for a playoff position. Sarah Catholic, have to give a huge shout out to that team and that community. Last week, they didn't play because of a tragedy that occurred at their school. There was a school bus that was in a crash on the way to school, and a student unfortunately died. So they didn't play last week, but they came back and played this week and got their first win of the season over Derry. So congrats to Sarah Catholic. Big win for them, and thoughts and prayers with their school and their community. And then in single A, Clairton topping Greensburg Central Catholic in a matchup between the two teams that were the top two in the conference last year. Greensburg Central Catholic beat Clairton last year, so a little bit of a revenge game for a young Bears team who's really starting to come together. I know my buddy Joe, who tunes into the show sometimes, is a big Clairton Bears fan. So shout out to Clairton, really putting themselves in position to win another conference title, setting themselves up now to have a game against Jeanette in week 9 with another Clairton Jeanette showdown with the conference title on the line, as we've come to expect. So, Jeanette still has to play Greensburg Central Catholic, who are kind of their neighboring rivals, but really, even if Jeanette loses that game, they'd still have a shot to split the conference title 3 ways in week 9. So big win for Clairton to assert themselves in the 1A Eastern Conference. The other two games, which really were big wins, but they were also fantastic games, actually both occurred at Dormont Stadium. So Friday night at Dormont Stadium, Seton LaSalle and South Park went back and forth all night until South Park finally edged it out on a fourth quarter touchdown to beat Seton LaSalle 35-28. And then on Saturday night, Fort Cherry and Bishop Canavan played also at Dormont Stadium, and in a shootout, Fort Cherry topped Bishop Canevin, who was, I think, the number 2 ranked 1A team in the state based on the Penn Live rankings last
Yeah.
week. And, Fort Cherry's got that super sophomore quarterback, Matt Seg, who we've been talking about all year. And we'll hear more about him a little bit later in the show. And he was just absolutely fantastic in this game. Fort Cherry topping Bishop Canevin to take a firm control or a firm hold on, probably the number 1 spot in 1A. But watch out for Cornell, who's also undefeated and also in their conference that Fort Cherry and Bishop Canevin still both have to play. The upset of, yeah.
That was great. I mean, there must have been something about the stadium this week. Friday and then Saturday, but that's just great stuff, especially Fort Cherry, a team that really, we've had their eye on really for a few years here now, but boy, have they really taken off.
Oh, absolutely. And we interviewed their head coach back the first year we ever did this show. That, his grandfather coached there, his dad coached there. I think the stadium's named for his grandfather. So, just so much cool stuff and cool history there at Fort Cherry. And now they've, got a team that's starting to come together and starting to really shine. And just what they did to Bishop Canevin was just absurd. I mean, nobody's done that. Even in the championship game last year, Union didn't put up 48 points against Canevin's defense. I mean, that was just an absurd, outstanding performance, and by all of them, all around. Fort Cherry came out, they got the ball first, they marched down the field and scored a touchdown, kicked an onside kick, recovered it, marched down and scored again. So it was 14-0 before Canevin even got the ball. And then Fort Cherry, I think, came up with an interception at like the 5-yard line or in the end zone and ran it out to the 5, and then faked a punt and wound up driving 95 yards for another touchdown to go up 20. So they didn't blink. They showed no fear, and they really just, took it to Canevin, and they were aggressive too, which, when you're playing the number 1 ranked team in the WPIAL, number 2 ranked team in the state, however you want to slice it, you've got to be aggressive sometimes. So, yeah, but they were aggressive. They did what they needed to do, and congrats to them. A huge win for them to set them up in excellent position now moving forward this season.
Yeah, clearly, and plenty of noteworthy results there, especially, starting with Gateway.
Yeah, I think, we talked last week about could Gateway be this year's Pine Richland, that they started the season slow and just got hot, and oh my, have they gotten hot. Brad Birch missed a couple games with an injury. A couple of their other offensive players missed some time with injury, and now they're really clicking on offense. Although Penn Trafford also is starting to click on offense, which is a dangerous thing because those two teams face each other this week. So should be a good one there in the 5A Big East Conference with Gateway and Penn Trafford, both of whom are really starting to come around now as we've hit the midseason point. Big win for Woodland Hills over Shaler. Shaler beat Woodland Hills last year for the first time in their school history. So Woodland Hills ran out to, I think, a 42-0 lead in the first quarter and didn't look back in that one. They were definitely on a mission. Latrobe beating Trinity, thanks to 2 pick sixes for Latrobe in that game to really break that one open. Elizabeth Forward had been smoking everyone all year, and I really put this on the noteworthy results because of how well Southmoreland played. And if you go back to our season preview show, I said my bold prediction for this year was Southmoreland would win their first playoff game in school history. And the Scotties really gave Elizabeth Forward everything they could handle. I mean, they were winning this game for a while, and Elizabeth Forward wound up just pulling away. But a really, really good performance for Southmoreland to keep it close and give Elizabeth Forward everything they had. And then a shout out to Avella, also whose coach Ryan Sakini we had on the very first episode of the WPIAL Blitz show. I think he was our first ever guest, but Avella last week had to forfeit their game against Bishop Canevin because they only had 10 healthy players. But this week, not only were they healthy enough to play, but they won. So that's so
Wow.
cool. Like, you don't have enough players to play, and then you get enough healthy guys that you can go out and play and win a game. And that's just awesome. So shout out to Avella as well. Really, really cool result there for them.
Yeah, really. That I tell you what, that's just perseverance with a capital P. When you don't have enough guys, you come back and then pull off the W the following week. Hats off to Avella.
Yep. Yep. Absolutely. So I hinted at it a little bit, but this week's WPIAL Blitz player of the week is none other than Matt Seg from Fort Cherry, who just absolutely had a phenomenal game against Bishop Canavan. He accounted for 7 total touchdowns in this game.
Incredible.
Which is just absurd. And in a big time game between 2 undefeated teams, to put up, over 400 yards of total offense and 7 total touchdowns. So what a performance from Matt Seg in this game. Just showing some highlights here of him. Here's another big 50+ touchdown run, and Canavan just couldn't stop him. I mean, he just was the fastest guy on the field. And at a game where you've got a Bishop Canavan team that's got multiple kids with D1 offers, Matt Seg just being the star of the show was an absolutely
running and throwing.
phenomenal.
I mean, that was the key. The multi-dimensional aspect to his performance is just pretty incredible.
Yep. And then playing on defense as well, obviously. We show the big hit there on defense too. So
and a nice run there. Look at that.
Yep.
Incredible.
Yep. All
great
around
stuff. I mean, we love those guys that go both ways, and and look, in some of the smaller schools, you just have to. I mean, I don't know what to say.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, so I really think some of those guys that play, 1A, 2A, even 3A ball might be some of the best athletes around, just because the endurance they have to never take it down off. They're playing every snap of the game, offense, defense, special teams. They're out there the entire game and don't get any plays off. You go up to the 5A, 6A level, you've got, guys who specialize in offense or defense, but some of the smaller schools just don't have that luxury. So overall, Matt Seg, incredible performance in a big time game. 160 passing yards and 3 touchdowns, 277 rushing yards, 4 touchdowns, 7 touchdowns. Like what do you even say about 7 touchdowns?
That's just that's a season. And I think if you ask Matt, I mean, he doesn't know any different. He just knows that he's out there playing football. And you ask any of these guys in the the 1A, 2A, even 3A schools that are out there for the entire game, including special teams, they don't know any different. They're just out there playing football, and they do it because they love the game. And guys like Matt Seg, I tell you what, he just epitomizes, what high school football is all about.
Absolutely. And he's only a sophomore. We get to watch him for 2 more years. It's incredible. I can't wait to see, how the rest of his career pans out. It's really exciting. All right. So some other big time performances this week. And like I said, the Fort Cherry game happened on Saturday. I mean, after Friday night, I thought for sure, I was like, well, Brad Birch put up 6 touchdowns. He's obviously going to be the player of the week.
Right.
And Brad Birch had a great game. I mean, 247 passing yards, 5 touchdowns, 121 rushing yards, and a touchdown. Like 5 touchdowns is nothing to scoff at. Or 6 touchdowns is nothing to scoff at. And then Matt Seg goes out and puts up 7 in a game against an undefeated team that's made the WPIAL championship the last 2 years. I was like, well, I got to give it to Matt Seg now. But yeah, all around some really good performances. Charlie Nagut from Elizabeth Forward, 2 rushing touchdowns, a receiving touchdown, and a kickoff return touchdown. He was pretty much all their offense in that win over Southmoreland. Kyle DePill from Franklin Regional also had 5 touchdowns on the night. Colin Brady from West Green had the most rushing yards on the night with 301 rushing yards and 4 touchdowns. So good to see Colin back on the field. I know there was a little bit of a scary situation there a couple weeks back where he had to get carted off with what looked like an ankle injury, but he's been able to bounce back and looking really good for West Green right now. Peter Gonzalez, wide receiver from Central Catholic, 268 receiving yards and 3 touchdowns. Peyton Wayner, Central's quarterback, threw for 5 touchdowns and didn't even make the list here. This goes to tell you how good the performances were this week in the WPIAL. And then the 2 Penn Trafford running backs. I mean, you want to talk about a 1-2 punch here. Last week, Taso Whipple broke the school rushing record with over 300 rushing yards. And this week, he only ran for 194 yards and 2 scores, and Ben Grabowski ran for 205 and 4 touchdowns. So the two of them combined put up 400 yards of offense and 6 touchdowns between them. I mean, what a combination.
It's going to be a tough act to follow this week, that's for sure.
Well, you've got the Pine Richland the Penn Trafford running game against the Gateway passing game this week, and what might be the best game of the week. So
yeah, absolutely.
That's gonna be a good one. All right, so we have 10 undefeated teams remaining in the WPIAL right now, led by Central Catholic in 6A, Peters Township in 5A, TJ and Aliquippa in 4A, Avonworth and Elizabeth Forward in 3A, Washington in 2A. Fort Cherry knocked Bishop Canevin from the ranks of the unbeaten. They were the only undefeated team to lose this week. And then Cornell and Southside Beaver also in 1A. Cornell, Fort Cherry, and Bishop Canevin all in the same conference in 1A. So Fort Cherry and Cornell will have to play in a few weeks. Cornell plays Bishop Canevin this week. So those, couple of those will drop off, and we'll see how the rest of it all plays out for how many undefeated teams we take to the postseason.
Are you surprised at this number? Do you think that there's more teams or less undefeated teams than what you might expect this time of the season?
I'd say it's probably about right.
Yeah.
And part of it's because of the way the WPIAL schedules, like the 5A teams in their, non-conference games play a lot of the 6A opponents. The really good 4A, 3A teams get scheduled against good competition. Like look at Bell Vernon, right? Defending 3A champs, defending state champs. They didn't play a single 3A team until last week when they started conference play.
Right.
Their non-conference schedule featured Laurel Highlands, who's a 4A team, Thomas Jefferson, who's a 4A team, who's the only one that beat them, McKeesport, who's a 4A team, and Penn Trafford, who's a 5A team. So as defending state champs to have to go through a schedule like that before you even get to conference play, like that's really difficult. So the way the WPIAL stacked the schedule of making teams play against some of their, old regional rivals, which is good, but it also makes them play against teams from higher classification sometimes as well. So I think that certainly makes a difference.
Well, and I think that I'm not surprised that I would consider that there's not a lot. And I would agree with you that I think it's a function of the scheduling, the preseason scheduling, that you really had a lot of great matchups and these teams really button heads against quality opponents. And consequently, that just leads that, there's a loss here or there. But, as we talk about, it really comes down to the league schedule that matters in moving on into the state playoffs and obviously contending for a WPIAL title as well.
Yes, absolutely. So our Streak Watch doesn't have very much exciting happening on it this week. The biggest thing is that because Aliquippa was the only team that had a active winning streak against WPIAL opponents stretched beyond this year, I had to add in all the teams that were 5-0 heading into last week.
Wow.
So all those schools got their 6th win of the year. Bishop Canevin had only been 4-0 because they didn't play a week 0 game this year. Aliquippa got their 20th straight conference victory. And on the losing streak side, all these teams not only lost, but lost pretty big. So the struggles continue for those schools on the losing side. And on the noteworthy results, number 6 on the losing streaks, Quaker Valley did end their 11-game losing streak with a win over Hopewell. So congratulations to the Quakers on ending that streak. And Kiski ended a 10-game conference losing streak with a win over Indiana. So congrats to the Cavaliers there. All right. In other news, last week we talked about Tyke Hayes from Aliquippa making a commitment to Penn State. This week, we had a player from my alma mater, North Catholic, making a
Right.
commitment to Penn State. Brady O'Hara, who's a tight end / defensive end. They're reporting him on the scouting sites as being a tight end. So I'm thinking he's going to play on the offensive side of the ball at Penn State. But Brady O'Hara from North Catholic committing to Penn State, which adds him to a senior class that already features Quentin Martin, Anthony Specca, and Peter Gonzalez going to Penn State. So he is the fourth WPIAL player going to Penn State from this year's senior class. Tyke Hayes is a junior, so we still have one more year of Tyke Hayes in high school football before he heads off to Penn State, which is why his name's in italics there. But you can see all the rest of the Division I commits we've had. Zach Ludwig from South Park, linebacker going to Michigan, played a really key role in their win over Seton LaSalle this past week. Seton LaSalle has a freshman, Khalil Taylor, who already has multiple D1 offers. He scored 3 touchdowns this week, absolutely lit it up. He scored a kick return that was phenomenal, but South Park and Zach Ludwig upstaged him a little bit and wound up getting the win. But that's definitely a name to keep an eye on in the future as well. And for all the players that haven't committed yet, Bruce has something to tell you about.
Well, I'll tell you what, all of those guys, you touched on all the Division, one athletes there, actually FCS players, but the vast majority of players that are going to get, college scholarships and offers are from obviously the the FCS and below level. And that's really where Go MVB is going to do a great job with your social media, getting you noticed by college coaches. Their reach of over 100,000 followers on Twitter. They're really doing a lot with Instagram. It's not a seldom used Instagram account. I can tell you with like Go MVB, they do a great job in touching all aspects of social media. And we talk about all the time, just go to gomvb.com/SSM special, or just take a look at GoMVB on Twitter. You're going to see just how much emphasis they put on making sure that you and your performances are out there for college coaches. They're going to accentuate the positive. It is a public relations firm geared towards athletes. 85% of GoMVB users get college scholarships, and there's a reason. Okay, the reason is that more college coaches follow Go MVB that get you noticed. And I tell you what, all I can say, and we talk about it all the time, just go see what Go MVB is doing for their users and check it out at gomvb.com/SSM special. It's a great way to get yourself noticed in front of college coaches. 85% of users get some type of offer for scholarship money at the college level. GoMVB.com.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that's worth mentioning too is for the high school students, not only are you competing against other high school students to potentially get offers or roster spots, but there's all the college kids in the transfer portal that coaches are also looking at. So the pool of potential candidates for these roster spots is vastly different than what it was 10 years ago.
Oh my gosh, yeah, exactly right. And you're competing for these scholarships just like you're competing out in that field every week. And look, everybody needs some help. I can tell you unequivocally, I talk to a number of families and I talk to players all the time. And the single biggest thing that I suggest is to really get some help in promoting yourself. And getting other opinions as well. And Go MVB is just part of that puzzle to be able to get your name out there. And that's the important aspect. 91% of college coaches are using social media for the recruiting process. You just can't go away from those odds.
Absolutely. And, like you mentioned, of getting help if people want to tag me in their highlight videos and whatnot that they post on Twitter, I'm happy to retweet them. I try and retweet all of them. Usually Saturday mornings, I have, a bunch of notifications on my WPIAL Blitz account. So sometimes I miss a few here and there, but I try and get everybody that tags me. So, feel free to keep tagging me. I don't mind it at all.
Yeah, well, our number of followers that we have pale in comparison to that of Go MVB. And forgetting the number of followers, it's the quality of the followers. College coaches are following Go MVB because they know that that's where the athletes reside. So it's easy for them to find athletes on Go MVB. That's what makes it so important for other, student athletes to get involved in Go MVB, and have them work on your behalf.
Absolutely. Yes. All right. So moving on, we are getting closer and closer to playoff season. The calendar's flipped to October. Now the races all heat up.
You mean they can't tell? They can't tell by that lighted skull over my shoulder that the candle is switched to October?
It's that time of year. And conference play has begun in every conference now. Every team has played at least one conference game. So I think everyone has. There might be one team that hasn't. At any rate, pretty much everybody's played at least one conference game so far. So just as a brief recap, in 6A, the top 4 out of 5 teams will make the playoffs. In 5A, only the top 2 from each conference plus 2 third-place teams out of the 3 will make it. In 4A, 4 teams from the Big 7 and Greater Allegheny Conference make it. 5 from the Parkway Conference make it. That's because those first 2 conferences only have 7 teams, and the Parkway has 8 teams. So more teams in your conference means you get more into the playoffs. In 3A, all 3 conferences get 4 teams in. There we go. And in 2A, there are 14 total teams, so 5 from the Allegheny and Midwestern and 4 from the Century Conference. And then 1A is the easiest one, where 4 teams from each of the 4 conferences will make the playoffs. So let's take a look and see where things are standing. Just a quick explainer on how the conferences work, or the standings work. It is based on conference record first, followed by head-to-head results, and then Gardner points, which is a strength of victory metric. So you get 10 Gardner points for each conference win that the teams you beat have, and then the tiebreaker points, which is a margin of victory up to +10 or -10 based on the game results versus conference opponents. So in 6A, Central Catholic has clinched the conference title. So that's over, done with. Central Catholic wins it. The only caveat here that I will say is that the WPIAL has had a long tradition of, if 2 teams finish at the top of the conference with the same record, they declare them co-champions and they both get a trophy, regardless of head-to-head results. That said, the only teams, Central only has 1 conference game left because they've played 3 of the 4 opponents. They've beaten both North Allegheny and Mount Lebanon. So the only teams that could tie them right now, they already have the head-to-head victory over. So Central will be the number 1 seed in the 6A playoffs. So they are the de facto conference champions. Even if someone else can get a plaque that says they were co-champions, Central has clinched the championship and the top seed in the playoffs. North Allegheny takes on Mount Lebanon this week in what is probably a big game to potentially decide who gets the number 2 seed and who, may not have to face Central in the opening round of the playoffs. And then non-conference games for the rest of them. Central against Pine Richland is probably the best of that bunch, although North Allegheny beat up pretty good on Pine Richland this past week. So yeah. PR not quite as good as the team they were last year. They've got a lot of young players, so they won't be down for long. And North Allegheny has a really good team too. So brought back most of the team that won the WPIAL title last year. But a big one between NA and Mount Lebanon this week to see who probably finishes second in the conference.
Yeah, really interesting here. I tell you, I say it all the time, as being a District 3 guy, it really is fantastic when Central Catholic is, kind of the relevant player in 6A from, the WPIAL. And I do that, like I said, from the perspective of somebody from the outside looking in.
Yes. Yeah. Oh yeah. It makes everything more fun when they're, in the mix.
They're in every level of football, whether it be high school, college, or professional. There are certain teams that are like the franchise, or the teams that everybody kind of looks at and looks to. And Pittsburgh Central Catholic is one of those teams, right, wrong, or indifferent, that everybody around the state look at every single season.
Yep, absolutely. And they might be, I I haven't seen Harrisburg play, but Central, the way they're playing right now, might be the best chance any Pennsylvania team has to beating St. Joe's Prep.
Yeah, we'll definitely see how it goes. Now the proof is really in the pudding now, as we head into the postseason play here.
Yep. All right, moving on to 5A, where Peters Township is the only remaining undefeated team overall in 5A. The Allegheny 6 Conference, I mean, this is just like a murderer's row of teams. Moon got a big win over South Fayette this past week, 24-3. Moon's defense has been playing really well the last couple weeks. They started the season a little slow, but they've come on in a big way. Bethel Park taking on Upper St. Clair in a big game this week, as well as Moon taking on Peters Township for more or less the top spot in the conference here. So a lot of big games here in the Allegheny 6 this week. And remember, in 5A, only the top 2 teams are guaranteed a playoff spot. So every game here is going to have huge potential playoff consequences.
It sure does. And, Peters has really distinguished himself. Everybody else is obviously battling it out between one another there. But Peters, far and away, has, played themselves into obviously the best position so far.
Absolutely. And the other crazy thing I have to mention about Peters Township is, you see they've only given up 20 points on the season.
That is incredible.
They have, I think, 4 touchdowns on either defense or special teams. So that means that Peters Township has scored 24 points from their defense and special teams returns, and only given up 20. So their defense is outscoring the other teams.
That is a great stat. Only a stat that my buddy Ian can come up with. That's for sure.
Actually, I do have to give credit for that one. The WPIAL Insider had that one on Twitter.
Okay, well,
so I'll give credit for that one.
But you still have to find
it.
it.
Yes.
That's right.
Yep. All right. In the Big East Conference, we talked about these 2 teams at the top of the show. Gateway and Penn Trafford have now separated themselves at the top of the conference, and both of them, after some slow starts to the season, are really playing well. Gateway's passing game is clicking. Penn Trafford's running game is clicking. They play this week in a monster showdown with first place on the line. So that should be a fantastic game between those 2 schools that have been rivals for quite a while. They've played in a conference back into the Quad A days, and they've been pretty strong rivals for back in the Quad East days too. So should be a good one this week between Brad Birch and Gateway's passing attack and the 2-headed monster that Penn Trafford has in their backfield.
I talk about, the fact that the WPIAL uses, the conference schedule and conference play to determine, who makes it to the postseason. And look, I'll be the first one to tell you that obviously I fancy the power ranking, but the fact too that you have an ability for a team like Gateway to kind of right the ship, okay? The same thing, that Pine Richland did last year, kind of right the ship and create momentum for a postseason run. I'll tell you what, I'll be the first one to tell you that's great as well. So I think you can have it both ways.
Yep. And another big game here in the middle of the pack, because remember, the top 2 are guaranteed a playoff spot. The 2 of the 3 third place teams will get wild cards. Franklin Regional and Norwin facing off in the middle of the pack here. Both of them currently sit at 1-1. So the winner there is going to have the inside track to a potential playoff spot as well, or at least getting into the wild card conversation.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. And into the Northeast Conference, where last week North Hills got their first conference win by thumping Fox Chapel. Everyone else played non-conference games. This week we've got Shaler taking on North Hills in a battle of teams looking to get into the playoff picture potentially. Penn Hills takes on a Fox Chapel team that hasn't won a game in a few years. The other ones play non-conference games. So not much happening in the Northeast Conference this week, but in the weeks to come, there's going to be some really good matchups because Pine Richland still has to play Woodland Hills. Shaler still has to play Penn Hills, and then Penn Hills against Woodland Hills in the season finale. Always a good matchup between rival schools. And that game last year decided who made the playoffs. I think Woodland Hills won 9-7, and Woody High made the playoffs, and Penn Hills was sent home. So a lot of big games still to happen, just not this week in the Northeast Conference.
Yeah, and Pine Richland and Central Catholic, such a rich tradition, in this game, and obviously they're not conference opponents there. But it doesn't mean to say that these guys aren't going to battle tooth and nail for this W.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And they used to be conference opponents when Pine Richland played in 6A and met for multiple quad A and 6A championship games over time. So these two schools have some history with each other too.
Yeah, I'm really interested. I'll be honest with you, since we're kind of getting on that, 6A, 5A thing. I'm really interested to see how, the new conferences and everything else shake out going into the next go around here. And that they are changing the way the PIAA is changing the way that they're counting the students. I think that's going to be very impactful in the WPIAL in a positive way to maybe get a few more teams in 6A and kind of expand that conference field there. What do you think?
Yeah, I think it's going to change a lot of things statewide with how players are counted, especially for the public school districts. The one thing that I think will be interesting to see is if it actually benefits some of the private non-boundary schools that they move down, which could potentially lead to its own kind of media firestorm. That it's like, oh, they did this new way of calculating things, and it let whoever, North Catholic, Amani Christian, whoever move down a classification. But at the end of the day, it is what it is, and the state reclassifies every 2 years, and they have the success formula that moves teams up, but that I don't like how it's implemented, but whatever. What I really think the state should look at, though, is, I guess I'll call it like a relegation formula too, because they have a way to move teams up. But when you've got a team like Fox Chapel, right, since they're here on the screen, Fox Chapel has a 15-game losing streak. So if they go winless this year in a 2-year cycle, they might win one game. Like, do they really have to play 5A again next year? Or could we move them down to 4A, see if they can kind of, regenerate their program a little bit? So to me, like, if you only win like one game in 2 years, like if you win 0 or 1 game in 2 years, you should be allowed to move down a classification, even if your enrollment says you should be higher, just to kind of help with that competitive balance a little bit too.
Well, I know what they do out here in District 3 is they kind of leave that up to the actual conferences to do that.
Right.
A lot of times the teams will, even though a 5 or 6A team, when a conference actually puts together, their sections or what have you, some of those teams that are struggling in the higher sections, they'll make a conscious effort to kind of move them down so that they have that opportunity, like you talked about, that, even though it is, a 5 or 6A school, it gives them an opportunity to kind of get back on their feet against, lesser opponents in, 4 and 3A. I mean, right, wrong, or indifferent, that's what some of the other districts do. And, I think that, the WPIAL could do that on their own if they wanted to, because they're the ones that are kind of setting things up.
Yeah, well, in other districts, you have kind of mixed conferences mixed leagues where you've got schools from different classifications all
Right.
playing in the same league. Whereas, I'll say this for the WPIAL, every couple of years when realignment happens, they send out a survey to all their member schools, and usually they get a pretty good response rate. And I think last time 75% of schools said they wanted conferences set up just with teams in their own classification, that they didn't want to have mixed classification conferences. So,
But I'm sure that the
when
teams that wanted to play down didn't answer yes to that. It's
well,
everybody
but
else.
at the same time, when 75% of your schools say they want it a certain way, you should, do what you can to accommodate that. So like you said, right, wrong, or indifferent, the WPIAL is setting things up to meet what their schools want. And that's
Sure.
kind of how it is. So
Yeah, exactly right. I know.
Yep.
I know.
All
Anyway,
right.
here we
Moving
go.
on to 4A. In the Big 7 conference, Latrobe got a big win over Trinity this past week, and Connellsville had that upset win over Hampton, which was a non-conference game, but Hampton had just beaten Armstrong the week before. So big result for Connellsville there, off to a 4-2 start after being kind of down in the dumps the last couple of years, or for a while actually. So Connellsville struggled for a while, but really good start to the season for Connellsville. Happy to see it for that school, that program, that town. And now you've got a situation here in the Big 7 where McKeesport and TJ have pretty much separated themselves up at the top. You've got Latrobe in second place, Latrobe in third place, and then Connellsville, and Trinity, and maybe Laurel Highlands could sneak in there if they can kind of figure some things out offensively. They've struggled a little bit on offense this year. Potentially getting back into the mix. 4 teams here are going to make the playoffs, so that win for Latrobe over Trinity was really big. Latrobe has 2 huge tiebreakers right now with wins over Laurel Highlands and Trinity to put them in really good position to make the playoffs. And really that last playoff spot's probably going to come down to Connellsville or Trinity, maybe Laurel Highlands if they can sneak in there. Obviously, those 3 schools all have to play each other still. So a lot to be decided here as far as who makes the playoffs, but McKeesport and TJ clearly the class of the conference.
And those are the ones that we're going to be paying attention to, quite honestly, as the season goes on.
Yep. Although, last year Latrobe kind of snuck into the playoffs and then wound up pulling an upset and winning their first playoff game since 1968. So don't sleep on Latrobe. They're on the upswing here too.
Yeah.
All right. In the Greater Allegheny Conference, or GA crazy as I sometimes call it, because you get these ridiculous results. Like Hampton beat Armstrong last week, and then Armstrong beat North Catholic this week, and everything's just a muddled mix of things in the middle here. 4 teams are going to make the playoffs. Which 4 they're going to be, I have no idea. So every game's going to matter here. Hampton takes on North Catholic this week in a battle of teams that have 2 conference wins. And, Kiski taking on Mars. Kiski just got their first conference win in, 10 games with that win over Indiana. So we'll see how everything shakes out, but a lot still to be decided here. And this is one where these teams always just beat each other and wind up in these weird tiebreaker scenarios. A couple of years ago, we had a 5-way tie in this conference. It gets ridiculous.
Yeah.
This is a fun one though. Like if you like tiebreakers, this is everybody's favorite conference to try and figure out, because it just ridiculous stuff happens every week.
Ridiculous is exactly right, and that's what makes this fun. Unfortunately, obviously, I think that the teams in this conference are kind of the sacrificial lambs when it comes to 4A this year. But I'll tell you what, don't tell anybody who's in this conference that it's not meaningful, because really everybody's got a shot.
Yeah, absolutely. And those are the kind of situations where, that's where the good storylines can come from, right? You can get a team like Armstrong, who won their first playoff game in school history a few years ago. Last year we had a situation where Hampton and Mars wound up making the playoffs, and North Catholic missed it because North Catholic missed an extra point in overtime in a game against Hampton, and on tiebreaker points Hampton edged them out by 1 point or something crazy like that. So it gets ridiculous, but it's fun, and that's where you can find some good storylines too.
Absolutely.
Over in the Parkway Conference, Aliquippa has set themselves up really well to cruise on into their week 9 game against Central Valley. They've got wins over Montour and West Allegheny, 2 of the other top challengers. This is really a top half, bottom half kind of conference. And Central Valley has a big game this week, though, against Montour, who's looking very good. Their only loss this year was against Aliquippa, and they battled Aliquippa for the first half of that game before the Quips finally pulled away. So should be a good one between Montour and Central Valley. Central Valley's also off to a 3-0 start in conference play. Their only loss coming in non-conference play against Avonworth, but they still have to go through both West Allegheny and Montour, obviously the big one against Montour this week. So Central Valley has a little bit of a tougher road to get to that week 9 showdown with Aliquippa, whereas Aliquippa has games against the bottom half of the conference. But the one thing I will say is that 5 teams are going to make the playoffs out of this conference. So the top 4 seem pretty locked in, but one of those bottom 4 is going to make it as well, which means the Chartiers Valley Newcastle game could be a big one this week, as Char Valley could potentially get a second win on their slate and put themselves in position to make a run for the playoffs.
Yeah, it's really hard to imagine who besides Aliquippa or Central Valley is really gonna, play any meaningful postseason, football. But it is what it is.
I wouldn't sleep on West Allegheny. I mean, they almost beat Aliquippa, so they gave Aliquippa everything they could handle, and Montour's been really good this year too. So I could see. I mean, I think I've said all along Aliquippa and TJ are the best 2 teams in 4A. I think, but I could see a team like a West Allegheny or a Montour pulling an upset and making it to the semifinals. I don't think either of them are good enough to make the championship, but I think they're good enough to make a run to the semis, which, could kind of break up that
that
quadrant
monopoly
of
there.
the monopoly that Aliquippa, Central Valley, TJ, and McKeesport have had on the semifinals for a few years. But I could see West A or Montour sneaking in there.
That's just got to be tough for those teams in 4A having, like you talked about, like that top fours, that Mount Rushmore at WPIAL 4A. I mean, that's pretty tough. But anyway.
Yes. All right, on to 3A. The Allegheny 6 Conference played their first round of conference games this past week, and they will play conference games from here on out. So big wins for Knock and East Allegheny to start themselves off well. Shadyside Academy edged out Freeport by 3 points. It was 31-28. That was another really good back and forth game that just missed making the opening slide of the show. But a big win for Shadyside there, who was a semifinal team last year after they upset Elizabeth Forward in the quarterfinals. But Knock really looking strong now, got that win over Deer Lakes, and has put themselves in position where with another win or two could find themselves back in the playoffs for the first time in almost a decade. So really nice win for Knock there, and looking really good for the Knights. The rest of the conference, still a lot to be decided, but every win matters here since 4 out of the 6 are going to make it. So, you win 2 games, you're almost guaranteed to make the playoffs.
Yeah, 4 out of 6 teams make it in a 5-game season. I mean,
yeah.
Hope springs eternal.
Exactly. Although I will say, last year Deer Lakes made the playoffs with a 1-point win over Knock and I think a 5-point win over Valley. So like 6 points determined who made the playoffs and who didn't last year in this conference. So, anything can happen in those games.
Yeah, sure can.
In the Interstate Conference, Bell Vernon is the clear favorite in 3A this year as the defending champions. They absolutely walloped South Allegheny this past week, bouncing back from that loss to Thomas Jefferson 2 weeks ago in resounding fashion. I think it was 57-6 or something like that. Mount Pleasant got a good win over Greensburg-Salem, and Elizabeth Forward got everything they could handle from Southmoreland. That Southmoreland team has the potential to be a little bit dangerous. Mount Pleasant's playing really well. So the Mount Pleasant-Elizabeth Forward game kind of sets up potentially, who's going to be that top challenger to Bell Vernon in the conference. Elizabeth Forward is undefeated, but got that big challenge from Southmoreland. So another game here to kind of see who's going to challenge Bell Vernon for the top spot in the conference. So should be a good one there between the Vikings and the Warriors. Oops. And in the Western Hills Conference, this one's going to be a really exciting playoff race because Avonworth has separated themselves as probably the best team in the league, probably the second best team in 3A with all their big wins. They got that win over Central Valley earlier in the year, and West Mifflin played them tight for about a half last week, and then Avonworth just ran away with it in the second half. So the Lopes are looking awesome. They're looking really, really good. But only 4 teams are going to make it, which means out of that grouping of Seton LaSalle, West Mifflin, Beaver, and South Park, only 3 out of those 4 will make the playoffs. And you've already started to see okay, well, West Mifflin beat Beaver, Beaver beat South Park beat West Mifflin. So there's the potential in there, or no, sorry,
Yeah.
South Park beat Seton LaSalle. My bad. They did not play West Mifflin yet. But every game between those teams is going to matter. And South Park's win over Seton LaSalle this week was pretty big for their playoff hopes. So potentially, last year, we had 3 teams finish in a 3-way tie between West Mifflin, Beaver, and South Park, but all of them made the playoffs because they tied for second. But with Seton LaSalle playing a lot better this year, the Rebels have put themselves into the picture as well and are going to mix it up. So a big one between Seton LaSalle and West Mifflin this week.
Anybody who's watched the show all year knows that I've been strapped on that Avonworth bandwagon, all year, and really feel strong about those guys that it's tough to obviously put somebody on a pedestal up there with Bell Vernon, but I tell you what, they're playing some really good football, and I'm really anxious to see how those guys go down the stretch.
Absolutely. The Lopes are playing fantastic, and it's really, really fun to watch. There we go. On to 2A. A little bit of a technical glitch there.
Okay, but
all right.
This is a great. I tell you what, I have a lot of fun with the graphics, as does everybody else. I mean, Ian just does an incredible job with all these graphics and standings, and you thought, oh my gosh, I forgot the letter R in there. Hey, great work, my friend.
I like to be accurate, but I think it
I
also
don't.
helps when we're talking about conference standings and making the playoffs
Oh
and
my
all
God,
that too, to
yes,
actually see
absolutely.
it. So in this conference, Steel Valley is really starting to run away with things. Derry just lost to Sarah. Burrell has lost to Amani Christian. So I think Amani Christian probably is the second best team in this conference. I would expect them to kind of rise up the ranks as we go further on. Amani and Sarah was the game that got canceled 2 weeks ago and didn't play because of the tragic situation that happened at Sarah Catholic. So I'm not sure if they're going to reschedule that game or just kind of see how things play out the rest of the year. But it's going to be an interesting race here to see which teams actually make the playoffs. 5 teams are going to make it. Ligonier Valley losing to York was a bit of a surprise.
Yeah.
York hasn't made the playoffs in quite a while, though. So that win for York, if they could also beat Apollo Ridge, could put themselves in position to potentially challenge for a playoff spot. And Derry too. Derry's got 2 wins under their belt. They went winless last year, so a really nice turnaround for the Trojans that might be able to, with another win or 2, get themselves into the playoff picture as well. But there's still a lot to be decided here. Steel Valley's season opening win over Amani Christian in their first conference game really is going to carry a lot of weight, I think, for Steel Valley winning the conference title as we go through the season. They do still have to play Sarah Catholic, but the way Steel Valley is running the ball right now, that's going to be a tough one for Sarah to stop.
Well, after seeing Imani, the opening game of the season, quite honestly, I'm shocked that they're in the position that they're in. Obviously, the game being canceled doesn't help them any. They've really got to put the pedal to the metal here down the stretch. I mean, if there's a team that I think really has to start paying attention, it's Imani Christian, and I do believe that they will. I think,
Oh yeah.
as do you. I think that we think that they're going to be in the end and contending for a 2A championship.
Yeah, absolutely. They are semifinal, if not championship game capable with the talent that they have. And, as they start to play some of these other teams towards the bottom of the league, I think they'll rise up pretty quickly. And, early in conference play here, some of the standings are somewhat a result of, the teams that you've played, right? Derry being 2-1, their 2 wins are over 2 of the 3 bottom teams in the league, which isn't to take anything away from Derry. But, everybody hasn't played everyone yet, and that's as the season goes on and we get more games under our belt. Like, I fully expect Amani to mercy rule Apollo Ridge this week.
Yeah.
So they'll I expect we'll see them rise up as well.
Right. I agree, and I keep my eye on those Gardner points.
Yep. Oh, they do matter when you get into tiebreaker situations too.
They do.
Yep. All right, into the Century Conference, where McGuffey and Washington have really separated themselves at the top of the conference. 4 teams are going to make it here, so Waynesburg's win over Keystone Oaks is going to carry some weight for them as long as they can get wins over Charleroi and Stowe Rocks. The Red Raiders should be able to get into the playoffs as well, which would be great to see for Waynesburg's program, whose coach we interviewed a few weeks ago. Keystone Oaks also has wins over Stowe Rocks and Charleroi, so they're looking in pretty solid position as well. McGuffey and Washington pretty clearly at the top here, although they both still have to play KO. I think those 2 are the cream of the crop, and I believe they play each other in week 8 or week 9, which will probably decide who wins the conference title between those, I'll say, somewhat rival schools. They're not like old rivals like since the 1920s, but they're relatively recent rival schools that they don't like each other. Actually, Washington had a few kids transfer to McGuffey this year, so that just adds a little fuel to the fire there too.
Well, look, I mean, you have to expect that with the way that the WPIAL just kind of redraws everything. Every couple of years, you have to expect the fact that there are going to be new rivalries that are going to develop. And quite honestly, that's really good. I'm very much a proponent of, redrawing the lines in certain circumstances, especially, by classification, as you've touched on the fact of that the WPIAL is, if you're going to if you're going to play by those rules, then play by those rules.
Yeah. Yep. Absolutely. In the Midwestern Conference, the story here is the two Lawrence County schools, Neshannock and Mohawk, both being 3-0 in conference play and 5-1 overall. A little bit of different offensive styles. Neshannock's got a pretty strong running game with a decent quarterback, but Mohawk's quarterback, Jay Rona, who's also, I think, playing in the WPIAL finals in golf this week. So, just an all-around great athlete.
Well, I
But
played football and golf, but they weren't in golf was spring, not fall. So I don't know how he does it playing football and golf in the same season.
Yeah, that's pretty incredible. And his name's appeared multiple times on our, best performances of the week list, where he's been throwing the ball all over the yard, putting up like 4 touchdowns a week. So Mohawk looks really good. This is arguably one of their best teams in school history. Neshannock made the semifinals last year and is off to a really strong start. But don't sleep on Beaver Falls either. Obviously, they lost that game to Neshannock where they went for 2 in overtime and didn't make it. But I fully expect to see Beaver Falls start to work their way back up the conference as well. They're 2-1 and have a game against Mohawk this week, which is a big one with a lot of conference title implications as well. And then Western Beaver, check this out. Their quarterback, Javin Peel, is a freshman and is leading the WPIAL in passing right now, which is just incredible. Wow. So Western Beaver off to a strong start as well. 5 teams are going to make the playoffs here. So I think the top 4 are pretty solidly in. But Elwood City, if they're able to make it, they've got that win over Freedom already. It would just be an awesome story to see them, they entered last season with the longest losing streak in the WPIAL, won a couple games last year. And if they're able to get into the playoffs last year, that would just be awesome for that school. So, that's one of those situations where, we talk about all year, this is where you find those really great stories, right? And a team like Elwood City potentially vying for a playoff spot is one of those just incredible stories that happens. And then as the season goes on, you obviously get to the championship contenders, but Elwood City's not quite there yet, but they're building towards it, which is pretty cool to see.
Yeah, we didn't pay attention. We started paying attention to Elwood City last year. So just keeping an eye on, obviously, as you touched on, the fact of this teams coming back. It's more of a crescendo rather than a spike. Okay, there's going to take time or what have you, but they're definitely on the way up. And kudos to Elwood City.
Yeah, really, really cool to see for them. On to 1A, where we have the most remaining undefeated teams, as we referenced earlier. There are 3 still remaining. Southside Beaver looking really, really strong and just put a pounding on Summit Academy this past weekend. Union also looking good after their 1 loss earlier in the year to Cornell, who's in the Black Hills Conference. Union and Southside Beaver will play in a few weeks, but for this week, we've got a game of Shenango taking on Southside Beaver, Union taking on Rochester. 4 teams make the playoffs in each of the 1A conferences, and it's going to be interesting to see how it all plays out because Shenango beat Rochester 2 weeks ago and then went out last week and lost to Northgate. So potentially some shakeups, some 3-way tie scenarios in play there in the middle of the conference, depending on how everything else plays out. But Southside Beaver and Union look like the best 2 teams in the conference, but you should never count out Rochester either, just because not only their history, their tradition, but their running game, if they can get rolling with that running game, when we had Fort Cherry's coach Tanner Gary on a few years ago, he talked about Rochester's running game and how, they run the same system from 4th grade through high school. And those kids, they only run a couple plays, but those kids know how to run them really darn well. And they're just so efficient and go out there and execute. So you should never count Rochester out either, even though they had that 1 loss to Shenango, just like WPIAL out your way, right?
Right. Right. And don't count out Union either.
Oh yeah. Oh, Union. I mean, they're the defending WPIAL champs. They're loaded. I know I picked Southside Beaver in the preseason to be the conference champs because I liked a lot of what they brought back, and that wasn't a knock on Union, but Southside really took it to Union last year. I think they beat them 35-7, and Southside had made the semifinals last year and lost to a really good Bishop Canavan team. So these are 2 excellent teams here. I mean, Rochester made the semifinals last year too and lost to Union. So, sure. There's 3 really good teams in this conference, and a lot still to be decided. But I like a lot of what Southside and Union have going on, and Union's quarterback Braylon Thomas is just a treat to watch.
Yeah, it's clearly they're both postseason bound.
Oh yeah. In the Black Hills Conference, we've talked a lot about Fort Cherry's win over Bishop Canevin to set themselves apart. Canevin now has to take on Cornell, who's another one of the remaining undefeated teams. Cornell has gotten off to a really good start, has a lot of speed on their team. They just squeaked by Burgettstown 14-13 this past week, though. So, we'll see how it goes between Cornell and Canevin. And that Olsh Burgettstown game that's happening on Saturday may wind up determining who the fourth playoff team in the conference is. I mean, I don't want to say for sure because, Olsh still has to play Cornell, Burgettstown still has to play a couple other teams. There's a lot still to be decided, but potentially that game, I'm looking at one that has big playoff implications in it.
Over 100 points difference, points for between Fort Cherry and Cornell. That's just incredible.
I mean, I'll say this, the first couple weeks of the year, Fort Cherry played some teams that I didn't think were very good, and they put up a lot of points. And I was like, okay, we'll see how they do when they have to play a team that has a better defense. And then they put up 40 plus on Olsh, and I was like, oh, wow, that was impressive. And then they put up 40 plus on Bishop Canevin. I was like, oh, wow. Like, Bishop Canevin's given up 61 points this year and gave up 48 of those to Fort Cherry. Like, that's insane how good their offense is and how dynamic Matt Seg is as a player. And yeah, it
transcends classification. I mean,
yes.
The way that Fort Cherry is playing, and I think Avonworth, I mean, it kind of transcends their classification, and that's what you love when you can get the that special talent level of those lower classification teams that can perform at a high level.
Absolutely. And the crazy thing is, we've talked about teams making the 1A playoffs, teams that we like, right? We like Union, we like Southside Beaver. We've been on Southside Beaver since our season preview show. We were one of the only people that were talking about Southside coming into the year, but we like those two. Rochester, you can never count out. Fort Cherry looks great. Canevin's obviously very talented. Cornell's really good. That's 6 teams right there. And we haven't even talked about Clairton yet. And you can never, ever, ever count out Clairton.
And you can never count out you talking about Clairton.
So. I love Clairton. It's, Clairton's just an awesome story. An old steel town that, has been economically down in the dumps for a while and just continually churns out these awesome football teams and awesome talents. And just, I love Clairton.
Well, sure. There is nothing wrong with that at all. That's just, that's just good stuff. I'd probably be talking about Clairton all the time too, if I was, a WPIAL guy as well, which a lot of people now are starting to, ask me about the WPIAL show. They think that I'm actually from the Pittsburgh area there, which I don't have any problem with that at all.
Yeah. So what I'm getting to is there's going to be at least 3, maybe 4 like really, really good teams that don't even make the semifinals. Like the quarterfinals in the 1A playoffs are going to be incredible. Like the matchups are just going to be outstanding. And Greensburg Central Catholic, they got beat by Clairton 40-28, but they never quit in that game. They scored a couple fourth quarter touchdowns to try and get back in it and keep it competitive. Clairton scored let me think. It was 32-28, and Clairton had a 4th and 1 and wound up running for a 40-yard touchdown. Their running back, Drasier Jones, was his 4th touchdown of the night. But, that was the difference in the game. If they don't convert that 4th down, Greensburg Central might get the ball back, march down the field, and score and win. So GCC shouldn't be counted out. Jeanette, love to see them back in contention. Went back to the blue helmets this year, which they wore back in the 1980s as well. So pretty cool to see. We're kind of, as long as Jeanette can get past Greensburg Central Catholic, although even if they don't, could still force a 3-way tie, looking like setting up for another Clairton Jeanette showdown in week 9 with the conference title on the line, which we've had since I think 2013 when Jeanette moved down from 2A to 1A. So really, really cool to see those two teams back at the top, because those showdowns have always been just awesome between those two schools.
Yeah, you can't get away from the traditional matchups, and that's what's great about WPIAL football.
Yes, absolutely. And Clairton had a little bit of a rough start to the season, but lost to Westinghouse, who reached the 2A championship state championship game last year, and then lost to a good Washington team who's still undefeated in 2A.
Yeah.
Yep. And those have been their only 2 losses. Once they got into playing teams from single A, they've beaten everyone they've faced, and their young players have really started to come together. They've got some sophomores and juniors on that team who are really, really talented. So, when you're a young team like that, sometimes it takes a few weeks to get going, and Clairton, now that they're playing 1A opponents, look outstanding.
Yeah, and people watching out there, don't forget, we do this live so that if you've got any questions or whatever like that, shoot them in the live chat. We'll be glad to recognize you and answer it if we can.
Yeah, absolutely. And our final conference of the night is the Tri-County South in 1A, with West Green getting Colin Brady back from that potential injury scare. Sets up a game this week against California with it won't mathematically be the conference title, but it's pretty much for the conference title. California's looked outstanding this season. They've been really, really good too. So California against West Green, these two have faced off a few times for the conference title over the last few years. So nice little budding rivalry there. And West Green was a team that for a while was down in the dumps, finishing at the bottom of the league, and now has kind of rebuilt their program and come back. Last year they only won 2 games, was kind of a blip down year for them over the look of the last 5 or 6 years. But California, traditionally strong program here in the Tri-County South, so should be a good one as those two square off this week with conference title implications, because it wouldn't mathematically clinch, but implications of potentially winning the conference.
Kind of in their old world in the Tri-County South, aren't they?
They are, but you get some of these good stories too, like Jefferson Morgan and Bentworth and those schools who haven't made the playoffs in a long time. Now, Jefferson Morgan's got 2 wins and, still has to play some of the teams that are at the bottom of the standings. So Jefferson Morgan, I don't think they've made the playoffs in over a decade, could potentially, get themselves into the playoff picture. So another, really good story there, but you're right. That's kind of the southwestern corner of Pennsylvania, a lot of rural, large geographic, but very small schools from an enrollment standpoint. But it's a lot of fun to follow because you never know what's going to happen from year to year.
Absolutely.
All right, so our games of the week, we've highlighted all of these, but I'll just run through them again. North Allegheny taking on Mount Lebanon in the only conference game in 6A, that Gateway Penn Trafford game with first place in the conference on the line, as well as the Moon Peters Township game with the first place in their conference on the line. Montour against Central Valley in 4A, and then a whole slew of important games in 3A since conference play just started there last week. Every game's got a lot of importance. Knock taking on Shadyside Academy in the Allegheny 6 conference. In the Interstate Conference, Elizabeth Forward taking on Mount Pleasant to see which team's going to be the top challenger to Bell Vernon in that conference. And then 2 big ones in the Western Hills Conference, Avonworth taking on Beaver and Seton LaSalle taking on West Mifflin. Beaver Falls taking on Mohawk in the Midwestern Conference. We talked about that one. Beaver Falls, after that loss to Neshannock, looking to get themselves back into the conversation potentially for conference title considerations, while Mohawk looking to give themselves a shot at winning a potential conference title, which they haven't done in a long time. So that would be pretty cool to see. And then Bishop Canevin against Cornell in 1A, as well as that West Green, California game. And then our non-conference game of the week that we talked about, Central Catholic taking on Pine Richland.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that the Central Catholic Pine Richland game, maybe the marquee matchup, but with not really a lot on the line, and Pine Richland kind of taking it on the chin here this season.
Yeah, Pine Richland got beat pretty handily by North Allegheny last week. Although I will say, to their credit, 2 of their big losses were to North Allegheny and then that Pickerington team from Ohio that they went and played. So they have challenged themselves a bit in their non-conference schedule. And their conference loss was by less than a touchdown to Penn Hills. So I fully expect once Pine Richland gets into the thick of their conference schedule, they'll put a few more wins on the board and be right in the mix for a playoff spot as well. All right, so our friends of the show this week, the KDK News radio team, led by Dan Zangrelli, friend of the show, who was on last year, doing the Gateway Penn Trafford game this week, which should be a fantastic game in 5A. WMBS, our friends out of Uniontown, have a non-conference game, but big matchup of Fayette County rivals between Albert Gallatin and Laurel Highlands. Albert Gallatin has gone the independent route over the last few years to try and rebuild their program. So should be a good one. Always a nice little measuring stick to see how Albert Gallatin matches up against the WPIAL opponents, to see if they ever decide to come back to play WPIAL football. So they're still in the WPIAL. They still play WPIAL sports in other sports, just not in football where they play an independent schedule. And then that Elizabeth Forward Mount Pleasant game being broadcast by our friends out of Greensburg, that, we talked a lot about that game being for the top challenger to Bell Vernon in the 3A Interstate Conference.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so our top
we're back at the end of the broadcast this week, huh?
Yeah, back at the end for the top fives. The top fives remain the same for both of us from last week. All of our teams that were in our top fives won. All of them won pretty handily. So I don't have any additions to mine. I think this is a fun little exercise we do where, for me, I try and rank them if, who would go out and beat all the other teams if they played them. And for me, 2 through 4 is really close. Like Aliquippa, TJ, Peters Township, I'd love to see them play each other. I really hope we get an Aliquippa TJ WPIAL championship game, because that would just be outstanding. But you could really rank those 3 in any order that you want.
You're gonna have to figure out how we can put together like a fantasy game between these teams or something like top 5. But look, Avonworth has been in my top 5 all year. Touched on the fact that I think that they're a top team regardless how they line up. Obviously it's a little bit different in real life versus a ranking there. Peters Township, it seems like I think we're splitting hairs with all these teams, right?
Yeah, you can, like I said, you can organize them in any way you want. If you want to put the undefeated team in 5A above the 2 undefeated teams in 4A, like you did, you can do that. If you want to put the 4A teams above the 5A team, like I did, you can do that too. So I just think
Fort Cherry, just it's almost like, we almost have to have that obligatory, or I do. I mean, that honorable mention, but it's tough to make it just 5, and that's the beauty of it.
It is. And I've been saying too that I'd like to do a top 5 big schools, top 5 small schools, to try and give some shout outs to some of those teams in 1A, 2A, 3A that, if I'm objectively thinking about it, like I'm not going to rank, even for how good Fort Cherry is, I wouldn't rank them above many 5A or 6A teams just because of the vast difference in size and line play and all that stuff. But Fort Cherry's been outstanding. That doesn't take anything away from them. It's just when I have to rank teams across all the classifications, the bigger schools, if I'm thinking who would win a head-to-head game, are going to rise to the top.
Well, we'll talk this week. I mean, you've been pretty much a proponent of having both. Quite honestly, I have them both in Fresh Set of Downs. So, maybe I'll coalesce here, and maybe next week we'll do like top 5s of big school, small school, but it won't be 5, and we'll have to agree on a number, maybe 3 or 4. But
I like 5.
Yeah, I know 5, like number 5, but all right. Well, maybe we'll do that next week, since, like I said, since I opened up the since I uncorked the bottle and the genie's out on Fresh Set of Downs, I guess maybe next week I'll coalesce and we could do big school, small school, which basically means what, 6, 5, 4, and then 3, 2, 1, right?
Yep.
All right. Well, we'll do it starting next week then, my man.
All right, that sounds good. Okay, so thanks to our friends at PA Football History for this week's WPIAL Look Back. We've been going through the history of the WPIAL, looking back at every 10 years. So we've now reached 60 years ago in 1963. And last week we did 70 years ago. The week before that was 80 years ago. So into 1963, when there were still 3 classifications in the WPIAL. West Mifflin North beat Butler, Montour beat Freeport, and Bellevue beat Avella. So some really interesting stuff here, though, that it's kind of hard to see in the small font, but if people want to pause it and blow it up on their screen, West Mifflin North had a quarterback in this game who was actually born in Switzerland and wound up moving to West Mifflin somehow, as via Canada, I believe. And yeah, it's crazy. And the other crazy thing was
And his dad was probably a fondue chef, huh?
yeah. And the other crazy thing was West Mifflin North had only been instituted as a school 4 years prior in 1959. So they won a WPIAL championship in just their 4th year as a school. So that's pretty cool. Beating a Butler team that had a lot of history and tradition coming into that game and was probably favored in that one as well. The other cool thing about this is that, a lot of these winners in 1963 were newcomers. It's West Mifflin North, which merged with West Mifflin South in about 20 years after this to just become the West Mifflin that we know now. That's their only championship in school history, was this one won by West Mifflin North back in 1963. And like I said, it only opened in 1959. So 4 years into your school, you won a championship already.
Wow.
Freeport, this was their first championship game in school history that they reached after starting football play in 1922. Freeport has the somewhat dubious distinction of having the most runner-up finishes in WPIAL history without ever winning a championship. So this was their first of 7 championship game losses. And then for Bellevue, this was their only championship in school history, and Bellevue and Avalon merged to form Northgate in 1976. So for both Bellevue and Northgate, this was their only championship in school history. But Bellevue won the Class B title.
Yeah, I was going to say Class B title. What the heck?
Yeah. Well, back then it was, it wasn't just all A, double A, triple A. It was double A, and B were the 3 classification names. So B became Class A basically when the WPIAL and Pittsburgh Catholic League merged in 1973/74, which is something that we'll get to talk about next week.
Wow.
When we talk about 1973, which 73 was the last year that the Pittsburgh Catholic League was in existence. So kind of cool tidbit of history there.
Wow,
that we'll talk
as
about
we kind of
next week.
march our way forward in time.
Yes. The other thing I'll mention, even though it's a week early, since this is the 50th anniversary of that 1973 championship season for those schools, Springdale defeated Union in a championship game in 1973. And they played each other this past week, and Springdale had, their, alumni from that 73 team all come back and, had as their alumni game. So kudos to the WPIAL schedule makers for scheduling a game between the 2 schools that played for a championship 50 years ago, on the 50th anniversary of that, to let Springdale kind of have that celebration of that championship, which
is that's monumental. Being a night, I'm going to age myself, but I graduated high school in 76. I couldn't even imagine, what it's like trying to get a football team back from 1973. But, considering, all the tradition and everything of the WPIAL, I imagine it didn't take a lot of arm twisting to get those guys back.
Yeah. Actually, my mom's cousin was a lineman on that team too, so I got the inside scoop on it from him. But the other thing I'll mention here about this Bellevue title, if you can see it over in the fine print here, that Avella took a lead. I think it was 18-14, and then Bellevue returned the ensuing kickoff for a touchdown to win 21-18. So that was the decisive points, was a 75-yard touchdown on a kickoff return after Avella had taken the lead. And speaking of Avella, we talked about them a little earlier in the show. This was the golden age of Avella football. Ralph Sindrich, whose name you probably know, NFL player, became an NFL agent, did a lot of other things, was a really good wrestler as well. He was part of some of the Avella teams that were some of those storied teams in the mid-1960s. He was the WPIAL Class B most valuable player in 1967. And Avella, being a small kind of rural community on the Pennsylvania-Ohio border in Washington County. This was the golden age for them, this decade between 1957 and 1966. They won 2 WPIAL titles, reached the championship game 4 times, and produced arguably, the best player in their school history in Ralph Sindrich. So pretty cool little tidbit here too about Avella football history.
And the golden age of football pictures too, not just with Ralph there, but I think every football player wanted the most outrageous picture of football moves or whatever like that. If it was running backs, I mean, with the ball and catching the ball and everything else, that was everybody wanted that really wild football picture, and Ralph kind of epitomizes that in this one.
Yep. Yeah, he went on to a fantastic career of being an NFL agent, was involved in a lot of high profile deals that kind of helped set the stage for the current salaries that we see in the NFL as well.
Wow, good stuff.
All right, so if you like hearing me talk, which I've done quite a bit of tonight, you can also tune in to our Steel City Blitz podcast that I'm on Thursday nights. So we are live on YouTube, just like this show is. This show obviously broadcasts Monday night at 9:15. Our Steel City Blitz show is Thursday night at 10. So tune in, or 10:05. So 10 o'clock ish on YouTube. Check it out on
we're
the
like 9:15 ish.
Yeah. So check it out on the Steel City Blitz YouTube channel. Look for the SCB Steelers podcast. You'll find it. Hopefully you enjoy it. We have a lot of fun. And Bruce, your Fresh Set of Downs show just started as well.
Yeah, we got the band back together here. Actually, Bob Long and myself and Dave Micah. We are every Tuesday night at 7:30. This week, special guest Jeff Wechter from Bishop McDevitt joins us to talk about his team. What it's been like going, actually defending a 4A championship. Broadcast their game last week for Penn Live. Jeff and I had some good conversation pregame, talking about their pregame or preseason schedule or what have you. And I'm gonna do a fresh set of downs, take notice game every week this week now, of a game that really the WPIAL fans need to take notice of in the eastern part of the state. And this week's take notice game is actually Wyomissing taking on Cocalico. Wyomissing undefeated at 6-0. They lost the consecutive 3A championships to Central Valley before that, and then made it to a state semifinal last year. Cocalico was lost to Pine Richland in the state semifinal last week in 5A. They just have a dynamite team. They are 5-1. So the game, the game that the WPIAL fans need to take notice of, Wyomissing at Cocalico. So very
really
good game there.
Interclassification matchup between a 3A top contender and a 5A top contender.
And that's a league game. That's Section 4 of the Lancaster Lebanon League. And you're exactly right. I mean, but you ask Coach Bob Wolf from there at Wyomissing, and he's just shaking his head. He goes, I don't know why we're playing these big schools,
So you said maybe there's some value in the way the WPIAL sets things up,
Well, I'll tell you what, there are some leagues in District 3, let's just say in the Mid-Penn League, where I think all classifications are represented. In the league that Steel High is in. Basically, all classifications are represented, from 6A Mifflin County all the way down to 1A Steel High. So it is pretty wild, some of the class leagues and the difference in classifications. So
yeah, it's very interesting how things are set up across the state in different districts, where you have different numbers of teams and classifications. Because there's only 3 or 4 1A teams in District 3, right?
I think there's down to 2.
Okay.
So and it isn't much on the 2A side either. I think there's like 3 or 4 teams on the 2A side. So not a lot of small schools, in District 3. But yeah, it is it's very interesting though, how you can get in one Lancaster Lebanon League Section 4. You don't have a 6A, but you've got everything from 3, 4, and 5, and it leads to some very interesting matchups, i.e., why missing in Cocalico. That is going to be, and why missing travels to Cocalico. And two teams that actually still play on grass fields. So pretty incredible there, too. But
Nice. Nice.
anyway, another good week here. Like I said, fresh set of downs is tomorrow at 7:30. I welcome the fans to you really start to pay attention to that because I mean, ultimately it's going to happen at Mansion Park or somewhere where these Eastern teams and the Western teams are going to start colliding, and knowing what these teams are all about is really what our both of these shows are all about. Correct, Ian?
Absolutely. We like to think that our show has, kind of threads that needle of being entertaining and informative. So that's kind of the thing we go for, entertaining. Obviously, we've got the skull head behind Bruce here as we're getting into Halloween season. I think last year you added like one new decoration each week, so we'll see what we come up with next week. We got a good strong start to the Halloween decorations there, but we just love talking high school football, and the more we can do to help spread the word about the good players, the good coaches, the good schools, the good storylines that are happening, all the better. And you're right, though, as we get closer into playoff season and championship season, it's good to know who's kind of out there and looming and lurking for the potential WPIAL champion to face once they get into the state playoffs as well.
And I invite everybody to listen to the conversation that we have with Bishop McDevitt head coach Jeff Wechter tomorrow at 7:30. I think it's really worth tuning in just to hear Jeff and have him talk about his team. I mean, obviously you've got a lot of 4A heavyweights out there in the WPIAL. I mean, this Aliquippa Bishop McDevitt postseason rivalry is really maybe turned into one of the best rivalries in the state of Pennsylvania. So hearing Jeff and hear him talk about his team and what he likes about his team and what it's like to defend a state championship, I think it's going to be a good conversation. So tune in tomorrow. We got Jeff Wechter at 7:30.
Yeah, that should be a good one, especially if there's any Aliquippa fans out there. We're going to want to tune in to see what's going on with, like you said, their Eastern rivals here.
Yeah, and they are. And I did broadcast their game last week. I'll have them again this week here too. But boy, they made short work of Milton Hershey, a really good conference opponent. So I tell you what, jam-packed show. Thanks as always, Ian, and we thank all the fans who tuned in this week. And we'll be back next Monday night, 9:15-ish here for the
once my kids go to bed,
Yeah, once the kids get it, once you get them all tucked in, we'll be on. So for my buddy Ian McMeans, I'm Bruce Badgley. Listen, thank you so much, fans, for tuning in, and we'll see you next week on the WPIAL Blitz Show podcast. So long, everybody.